off.
Yeah, great. Oh, well, thank you everyone for joining and taking time out of your busy days. I am Joanna, one of the co-founders at Trace. Really excited to spend some time today talking with our fabulous guest speakers, Ben and Ermos, about the process of measuring emissions. So quick introduction to what Trace is. Trace is a climate tech platform that helps SMEs on their journey to net zero and engages their staff in the process. This webinar is being held on many different lands today, and I'm coming to you from Australia. So I'd just like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people and wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners of the land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I can see lots of registrations today, lots of different businesses here. And I think one thing we all have in common is that we care enough to take action, and we're all intrigued to learn more. So we've got 30 minutes together. And for most of you, this is the beginning of your day. So I hope you've all got a tea or a coffee present, and we'll kick off. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to intro our great speakers. We're going to talk about why you should measure your emissions, how you can measure your emissions. We'll then take a bit of a sidestep and dig into work from home emissions specifically. And then what next? So what do you do once you've measured those emissions? What comes in that journey afterwards? And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So first up, we've got our wonderful guests. Ben, give us a wave. head of CSR at Finder. And we've got Ermos, ESG manager at Runway East co-working space. So they're both going to be sharing insights with us today on how and why they've chosen to measure their emissions in their organizations. You might all have lots of questions as we're going along and you're hearing things from the speakers, so feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and if we can answer them in the moment, we will, but if not, we'll save them for the end. Okay, great. So first up, I wanted to just briefly take a moment to set the scene for why we're all even here and bothering to have this conversation. It's really important that we clearly understand the why behind a business measuring their emissions. I'm sure I do not need to convince any of you today that climate change is real. Scientists have estimated that by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will reduce the odds of initiating the most dangerous or irreversible effects of climate change. To achieve that, we initially believed that we needed to reach net zero by 2050, and this has actually been changed to 2030 now to avoid irreversible damage. That requires action from governments, companies, and individuals, and that is why we're all here today. I wanted to take a moment and highlight the difference between two terms that are thrown around a lot in this space: carbon neutral and net zero. So becoming carbon neutral is something that can be done today. It's when you've measured your emissions and offset 100% of them through certified carbon credits and identified opportunities to help you reduce those emissions going forward. So, and as I said, that's achievable today. Whereas net zero, this is a really long-term goal and ambition for a company, and actually means that you've reduced your emissions by 90% and offset only the remaining. The target is really well defined, but the journey to get there is really not, and companies of all sizes are grappling with how to get there. So the first step on that journey is measuring your emissions. First up, I wanted to ask Ben, you have recently, congratulations, made Finder carbon neutral. Can you explain to us why you decided to do that as an organization, and how did that conversation and process start internally?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, the whys are very similar to your whys. I mean, bigger picture, like net zero by 2050 is where we need to get to. Like, devastating climate crisis is here, and I think it's particularly present in Australia, where the head Finder offices are, in terms of real life climate impact. So I think, and all three of our founders are parents, and I think, you know, when you're parents, you have that longer term view of the world, and you go, God, what are we doing here? And we've got to do something about it. So I think specifically why we started with going carbon neutral first. I think for us, yeah, it was that step one. It was measuring where we're at. And then I think in terms of there's a big debate in our world around offset or not. And my view is, offsets aren't great. Obviously, it's not the solution, but I think it's better to do it than not do it, basically. So we go, here's our emissions. We are going to offset what we've got to. And we're actually also in the process now of setting science-based targets and kind of plotting our journey towards net zero. But yeah, that was kind of it from Finder.
Yeah, fantastic. That's awesome to hear about the science-based targets too. Amazing. I've got a quick recap here of some of the reasons, I guess, and exactly some of the things you've just shared, why it is important as a business to measure your emissions. I guess what you can measure, you can manage. If you've measured them, it helps you understand how you can actually drive change internally, which is exactly what you've just said, and get yourself to net zero. It is one of the first steps in that process. So that's awesome to hear. A couple of other ones as well that I guess we often hear is transparency is just in such high demand now. Your customers, your shareholders and beyond are all demanding this and want to know this about what they're purchasing and using as a consumer or as business. And finally, something that I love about that has changed in the world recently is that this is being required and demanded of people for applications, grants, awards, things like B Corp, which are going like really crazy with applicants. So it's awesome to see. But I guess, how does it all work, or how do we actually do it? Which is a topic we could probably spend hours talking about. Ermos, would love to hear from you. I know Runway East, the co-working space as an organization, is in the process of measuring their emissions. How could you tell us a bit about how you're tackling this, what that process looks like for you?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, obviously, to set a target, you need to first measure your emissions in the first place, just to get some sort of baseline to track, which, any reductions that are made. And we realized we needed help. I'm sure you'll go into this, but we need help with those pesky Scope 3 emissions, which are kind of like the hardest part of your carbon footprint to measure. So we're working with a kind of a carbon management kind of consultant / people that kind of provide software to help us measure our emissions. And funnily enough, actually, our process started before procuring any external help when we were completing our B Corp application process, because that was part of kind of the information that was needed. And as a side note, Runway East is now proudly B Corp certified, which for those of you who are going through the process will have been through the process know that it's not easy at all. But yeah, that kind of kick-started our motivation, and we're kind of in the middle of measuring our emissions at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. Awesome. And is there anything that you, I guess, in measuring your emissions that you'd be able to help the businesses within Runway East, if there's any of them here today?
Yeah, so I suppose the workspace you're in can impact your carbon footprint, especially with the type of energy that's being used in the building. So that's why at Runway East, we only commit to procuring, well, it's part of the reason we commit to procuring 100% renewable electricity where possible, not only because it's better for the environment, but just from a reporting standpoint as well, because it can be reported as zero emissions. And we also try and support our members with their carbon measurements by providing data on their company share of energy consumption too.
Amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic. And so over to Ben, could you, I guess, give us a bit more detail about what did the process actually look like when you decided to go carbon neutral and measure your emissions? What kind of information did you need to collect? And did you have any tips for businesses who are about to start this journey?
Yeah, so it was a bit complicated for us. I have a background before I worked at Finder working in sustainability consultancy, so I kind of had the skills to do a rough carbon footprint for Finder for a while, and we were doing it internally. And we used that for a few applications and things like that, and it was pretty accurate. But I think when we decided we wanted to make it more of a public announcement, we just wanted a bit of kind of third-party verification of what we're saying wasn't just, hey, Ben from Finder says Finder's good. we wanted some other party to be involved in that. So that's when we started looking for, some kind of external party to help us with it. Just around the same time, Joe, you're obviously ex-Finder yourself, and I knew you already, and I knew you'd set up Trace, which was working to help organizations like Finder do this kind of thing. So we got speaking to you, and I think our experience was working with a kind of tech platform like Trace in the way that you guys work, made it significantly cheaper than working with a consultancy to get the kind of same outcome. And we were also, there was a lot of appetite from within Finder to just support Joe and ex-Finder alumni from kind of launching your own business. So a couple of reasons, but I think, and then from once we decided to work with Trace, super straightforward. It only took probably 2 or 3 weeks where we're going back and forth with the team at Trace, answering lots of questions. I think we might touch on it again later, but I think particularly the first year, we measured ours for the first time fully last year, including scope 3, and huge part of that last year was working from home emissions. So like most companies like ours during the COVID period, there was a lot of people working from home, and that's not really changed. There's still a lot of people working from home at Finder. We're definitely more of a remote business than we used to be. So I think those working from home options, I really thought Trace's approach for doing that was great. We did a survey with our whole crew here at Finder, where we asked them questions about where they work, how, what kind of setup they have, what kind of energy plan they have, so that we can get fairly accurate assumptions around what work from home emissions would look like at Finder. And then there's a whole question whether they should be scope 2 or scope 3 or maybe even scope 4, and where you put them in your footprint. But I think it is really important to measure that stuff. So the process was pretty easy. We answered the questions, we worked with them, we gathered all the information needed, and then we were given the kind of platform from Trace where we can log in, look at the emissions. There's also, I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong now, Joe, but we can put our targets into the platform and then kind of measure, scope out where we want to go. So I mean, and that was it from us, I guess. On the second question, tips for others doing this kind of thing. Explore your options. I think getting some kind of external verification does just give you a bit more transparency and validity to your claims. So I think it is worth doing. And then shop around a bit, speak to a bunch of consultants, see if you can find a Trace or equivalent to help you, because I do think that makes it very credible and takes some of that. I always think, even if you're confident in this space, being the person who goes, I'm the, I'm working this organization and here's our footprint for this year, without someone who you feel like you can go back to and just double check, is a bit nerve-wracking. So I think it's just like a final, check and balance on making sure you're doing the right stuff.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing.
We went through exactly the same.
Segue.
Oh, sorry, ruined the segue, but I was just going to say that actually, with a few Google searches, you can figure out some parts of your carbon footprint. There are quite concise resources out there where you can kind of figure out part of it. But even though I did that and I work in sustainability as well, you do need someone to A, to double check your workings, and B, just to avoid any sort of greenwashing, and C, to actually get your kind of a much better idea of your whole carbon footprint. I do think you need to be working with people in the field. I think sometimes the greenwashing part is often unintentional, and actually someone coming in just make sure that you're not unintentionally greenwashing and kind of your emissions are lower than what they should be.
And I think just
really great point.
I'm just going to double down on that as well, Joe, in that similar, we knew we're a website business. We run comparison websites around the world, basically. That's what we do. And I think we knew that our kind of data warehousing and web hosting was a huge part of our carbon footprint. But we didn't have, I tried a bunch of different ways to make those calculations, but I actually think Trace's approach of using spend and the supplier and kind of spend-based emissions was actually probably definitely the most accurate way of doing it. So yeah, I think that was really helpful for us, and it was the eye-opening for me of like, oh, here's best practice on how you do this today.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, and so I guess this slide just sort of summarizes what you guys have just gone through, which is cool. You have kind of 3 options out there: do it yourself, hire a consultant, or use a platform that can help you facilitate that process for you, like Trace. The solutions all vary in timeline and cost, so it really depends on what the business's size is and what your budget is, so you can decide what works best for you. I think it's a great point that you both made. Scope 1 and 2, there's a lot of public resources out there, so it's quite easy to potentially calculate those, particularly as a service-based organization. But it's scope 3 where it all becomes a bit more complex, and it's actually where 75% of an SME's emissions lie. So it's incredibly important to get that part of the puzzle right. Yeah, fantastic. We've actually touched on some of this, but I was going to change gears slightly. And so particularly with the pandemic, many of us are now working from home, and that means that the bound of influence and footprint of an organization is now in many different homes around the country. So we've done some analysis of the Trace customer base and found that nearly a quarter of a company's emissions are actually embedded directly in staff through their work from home and commuting. So work from home being a huge part of that. So it's really important that this data is incorporated in that process. Ben, you've already touched on this as part of your journey. Were there any other benefits, would you say, internally to going through that process with your staff?
Yeah, so I touched on the reality of how we did it. So we sent out a survey, and I think the key benefit of doing that, other than being much more accurate on not just working from home emissions, but also commuting emissions and kind of employee transport stuff, that it really engaged our crew in the process. So we announced that we were working with Trace and that the ambition was to go carbon neutral and to set off on this net zero journey. And just by giving, like, that's an announcement itself, you can do that for however you do your internal announcements, but by then saying we're doing this and here's something for you to do, which is fill in this survey, actually really engaged the crew in that process. And part of that was Trace has a kind of direct to consumer offering as well. So when the people from the Finder team filled in the survey, they also got their kind of personal carbon footprint, and it gives them, like, I can't remember quite what they were, but it's like there's Australian themed animal based kind of worried wombat and, like, you know, advanced koala and stuff, basically giving you a rating on how good you are as an individual and how low your personal carbon footprint is for your household. So it was fun, and then we had people sharing that in our Slack channels and stuff like that, and it just created a bit more conversation, more than just, hey, we're doing this, we'll come back to you when we've done it. It was, hey, we're doing it, we need your help in making it really accurate. And that was really helpful for making this a bit more kind of collaborative with our team, rather than, hey, you know, management decided we're doing this, we're gonna go do it. Go away and do it and come back and go, hey, we did this, isn't that great? You know what I mean? So it just really was a bit more engaging for the crew.
Yeah, awesome. Great to hear. So now we're just going to dig into, I guess, what you should do once you've measured your emissions really briefly before some Q&A, because we're not just measuring for the sake of measuring. This slide just kind of shows the process that we go through here at Trace. So first we measure those emissions, and importantly scope 1, 2 and 3, including all work from home information. We believe employees are an essential part of this journey. You need to engage and harness them to, like, allow you to get to net zero. So we run a campaign that engages them from day one and allows you to power that work from home footprint with real data. As a member of Trace, we then provide a lot of content and material, toolkits, policies, and data to allow you to measure and manage those emissions in an ongoing manner. That allows you to make decisions that drive operational change to reduce your footprint. And finally, it's about offsetting the rest of your footprint. So we manage a portfolio of certified carbon credits. So you don't need to go somewhere else to do that part of the process. We can do that for you and then provide you with that badging to enable you to talk about being carbon neutral. There's just two parts of this process that I really want to call out that are personally important to me as a founder at Trace and are embedded in our product. And I think it's been mentioned today by Ermos with the greenwashing concept, but transparency and storytelling. We understand that this world can be really confusing and overwhelming, and so communicating your impact is hard. And this is why we provide you with a toolkit that is public to enable you to talk accurately and credibly about the impact that you're having. So you don't need to worry about those claims that you're making, like they are true and credible. And we do that through impact URLs, badge snippets, and other downloadable assets. And finally, it really is just engaging your staff in that process. This, as kind of Ben just described, actually, it makes this more than just a leadership or a board level tick box and something that your entire workforce is engaged in and then can actually drive change, which is what this is all about. I've been talking for long enough, so I want to leave you with a few quick things to take away from today, if nothing else, before we move into some Q&A. Start today, allocate someone internally to get this going, give it to them as a responsibility, engage your teams and make it fun. And it's about progress over perfection. Most of you will have all the information that you need to get started on this journey today. So without further ado, Q&A. Have we got any questions coming through?
How do we want people to ask questions, Joe? Is it in the chat?
Yes, I believe in the chat.
We've got a
How
question.
can you make?
We've got a question from Stephen.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay,
sorry.
I'll read it out. Shall I read it out?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I just wondered how you can make your employees respond accurately to a work from home survey. Oh, good question.
I can have a first go at answering that, Joe, because we've obviously been.
Yeah, go for it.
I think generally, because this is something that most people are very engaged with, broadly speaking, the accuracy is pretty good. The only accuracy issues we found were mistakes rather than like malicious attempts to increase our footprint, if you know what I mean. And I think it's often rounding errors or people putting in monthly, a yearly bill instead of a quarterly bill for their energy or whatever it might be. So I think you can see it. Sometimes it's really obvious when there's inaccurate data. And then I think secondly, depending how big your team is, I think, we did it with 400 staff globally. So one slightly inaccurate result kind of averages out across the team. So I think broadly what we were doing with our survey was trying to get assumptions that were accurate enough to then be applied across the rest of our team. So I think that averaging, the law of averages kicks in. So even if there isn't one inaccurate one in 400, it's not a huge problem. But yeah, I think you do have to be slightly aware of that as a possibility.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the survey that we run is deliberately designed to allow you to fill it out as an individual. It's not incredibly obvious which questions or what data is used to power the company calculator. So, and that's very deliberate so that you can't overthink it. And it is about kind of calculating your personal journey and getting that character at the end, which helps that be a bit more genuine. Because you're only kind of kidding yourself if you fill it out wrong. And we've got another question. I hope that answers your question, Stephen. Thank you for that one. We've got one more question here. Have you ever done this exercise with charities? Yes, I believe. I'm trying to rack my brains thinking about our community in Trace. We have done this with some Australian-based charities, engaging their workforces in the kind of activity of going carbon neutral as a charity. Yes, very much the same as an organization as the process is carried out. Any other questions?
I have one for Ermos.
Go.
No, I'm intrigued to hear from Ermos. Like, obviously, you work with more of the consultant-led approach. Just keen to hear. Like, this is obviously a Trace platform. Sorry, Joe. Just keen to hear a bit more about how you found that, and whether, like, what you'd recommend about that process as well.
Well, so I mean, it's good at the moment. I mean, we're in the middle of measuring our emissions. I think the timeline is longer in terms of, like, you know, what you showed on screen. I think the timeline is a bit longer. I mean, I get one of the advantages is there's, like, quite a lot of kind of back and forth in terms of, like, what, you know, it's just very easy to kind of get in contact with them, and the customer service has been really, really good. Again, not saying that Traces isn't, it's just my experience. But so we can have multiple good experiences. But similarly, we kind of we've sent over our kind of spend data, and then we're going to try and, like, refine that a little bit in terms of, like, our highest emitting kind of activities. And then hopefully at the end, we'll get our kind of plan of, once we get that number, you know, plan to reduce emissions and set a realistic net zero target. But no, it's been good. I think, you know, it's a bit of the first time recording non-financial data, really like a lot of non-financial data. So I think we're just trying to give it a really good stab, and then hopefully, as we kind of, you know, it's an iterative process. As we do it again and again and again, it'll get easier. Also,
another quick question for you, Ermos. Are you doing any public reporting on your emissions other than B Corp?
Not yet. I mean, just because we're still in the process, but it's not something we're averse to at all. I guess everything we do at the moment, just as an SME, is, like, completely voluntary. So, you know, kind of anything we're doing is good. But I think we would definitely like to get into the public reporting side of it later on. Are you?
Yeah, we're about to do our first impact report publicly, which is quite exciting. But yeah, it's the first time we've really done any public reporting, so it's a bit new for Finder. So we're just finding our feet there.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've got a few resources because we started drafting it a bit, but it's not out yet. So I'll send those over to you later.
Yeah, amazing. How have you found the process of the SBTI, Ben?
Yes, it's science-based targets, for those who might not know, is a UN and Carbon Disclosure Project-led project that try and align kind of corporate emissions targets with that climate science that Joe was talking about at the start. So where we need to be by what time to avoid the worst kind of climate catastrophes that are possible. It was really simple actually for us, because we are in the SME route, which means if you're under 500 employees, there's now a kind of smoother, more streamlined process for applying. So it was all quite straightforward, and it means you get quite blunt targets. So ours is 90% by 2050 from a 2021 base year, basically, for the net zero target. And then they also then plot you on a shorter target for a 2030, or you can choose a year basically, but I think we'll probably go for a 2030 target. So it was quite straightforward. I think having emissions from Trace and someone who we could go and ask, I mean, I've been back and forth with your team this week, Joe, talking about some specifics around how we should answer some of those questions. And because there's some technical stuff around how you report stuff like electricity emissions in your scope 2 figures. If you plan to use renewable power or renewable energy contracts in the future to hit your target and to reduce your emissions, you need to choose a certain way of reporting your emissions to begin with for that to be possible. But yeah, it's been pretty, I think it's pretty hardcore if you're above 500. There's a whole process where you go back and forth with the team. And I think it just takes a lot longer because there's a whole, like I say, there's I'm sure a stack of applied targets, and there's like you can look on the website, there's a bunch that'll be submitted but not reviewed and not accepted. So yeah, just if you're wondering how long that take, find someone who's just submitted and see how long it takes them to get approved. I think it takes a long time if you're going down the non-SME route.
Right, good to know. Yeah, that's awesome though that they have a more streamlined option for SMEs. Great to hear. Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's about time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Feel free to reach out to any of the speakers, myself, with any further questions that anyone might have.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, and
Thank
have
you,
a
Joe.
great day, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Bye-bye.